So we want this off the foot on the ankle. We want the pivot point lined up with the knee. Okay, what's the difference between this and the lying leg curl?
Hip flexion.
Hip flexion. Why is that significant to the hamstrings? They're more lengthened, right? So this is a more lengthened position, right? Is it a more lengthened overload? It can be with this, right? Okay, but I can overload the lengthened position of this or the lying leg curl, right? But only this is the lengthened position, and that is a shorter position, right? So if I wanted to overload the lengthened, I would move this where? T3, okay? Now, because the gastroc is pretty much doing all the work in the lengthened position, what might actually be a better place to put the peak overload? How about one that comes on right there? 5. So if you had to pick, if you wanted a perfect resistance, perfect ham for a leg curl, it is the prime 5, right? Okay. Now, there's plenty of brutal things that you can use the other settings for, but if you're only going to use one resistance profile that day, I would use the 5, okay? Because it is not going to make this the hardest, it's going to make this the hardest, right? Which is where your muscles are going to be strong, right? But the hamstrings are becoming the better mechanical solution, okay? If somebody is all calf and no hamstrings, right? Then I may just say, well, we're just gonna make sure that all of it's down there, and then you are gonna do nice and slow and make you pause at the bottom where the calves are doing very little and the hamstrings are doing not. And then eventually I will work you to where it's a more appropriate resistance profile, but I have balanced out your strength imbalances. That makes sense? Okay. What are the other advantages of this over the lying leg curl? Other than it's also a flying chair. Yep, much easier to stabilize the pelvis. Why? Because it's not really that you're sitting on, like, if this wasn't here, this would be awful. She would just be flopping all over the place, right? You know, like a truck with no suspension down one of our country roads. But if she has something to stabilize closest to the joint she's trying to move, and it basically prevents her leg from being able to move right next to the knee, that's going to be as stable as you can get, right? So we have another option here, right? So the advantage of this over that, they're both stability points that are very close to the joint. But if you go ahead, make sure it's not on a gazillion pounds and just do a rep for me. So as she comes here, right, the force on this pad is pulling her that way. The other pad is saying, all right, I'm going to push you here. So the other pad may provide a little bit more stability out of the lengthened, but this provides a lot more stability in the bottom half of the rep because it keeps it from pulling forward. How many of you guys have done the seated leg curl and it just keeps pulling like you this way, and then you're fighting and you're doing all of those things, right? So when you get strong in a seated leg curl, it sucks because it's very hard. It's really hard, especially if you're in between notches and you got to decide whether or not you want to destroy your quads or have a little bit of slip. Like you got to choose the lesser of two evils, right? So with this one, it pretty much eliminates that, okay? I don't want to say that it's unanimously always better, because you could argue that, well, in the lengthened position, exploding out of that one dynamically might be a little bit better because the stability is better in this position. But what that is the calf position. As soon as she gets to here, where it's mostly hamstring, is right where this one starts to be better. So for hamstrings, this is going to be just the superior form of knee stability, right? If you have that, okay? Now occasionally, depending on the shape of your knee joint, if there's a tiny little bit of slack in here, you know, you shove a pad or a towel or something in there, and then it'll feel. Basically what you want is you want this to be as tight as possible, which is why I think a cool idea would be a Velcro thing, like a dense, like expansion, like thing that we could maybe add for that, for a few of the very, you know, small jointed peoples, right? And then for the big people with big fat old lady knees like me, like it feels great, right? So, you know, but Cody, you know, he's got those nice, pretty aesthetic joints, so he needs a little bit of cushion, okay? You know, give him a couple more years of heavy squatting and leg pressing, and he'll be different. And the top of his femur will go from this to like this flat, like dinosaur bone looking thing too. It just happens, right, Adam? All right. So last few execution tips, right? Wherever your rec fem is in there, do you think it's also important here if the rec fem is important for hamstring feedback? Yes, right? So where she should be in this seat should be within the active range of her rec fem, in my opinion, right? Could you argue that like we could, I mean, Chelsea, I'm sure we could just take her and just like, all right, look at all this stretch that we can get here. But that may not actually be an advantageous place for her to train hamstrings. Maybe actually this disadvantages the hamstrings and makes it really good for this a place for her to do partials for calves, right? But for hamstrings, we probably want that rec fem feedback. Sorry, I was pulling her here, right? If you do the lean forward, it's important that if she keeps a neutral spine. So this is actually what she can get without rounding the back. So that would usually be the maximum amount of extra stretch that we could get there, right? Some of you guys may need to go back. One thing I do like about this, or even if you do use the other one, is to have these handles down here, because what she can do is she can pull her butt into the seat, which is going to help her maintain a neutral spine, right? Versus having the handles here, what does everybody typically tend to do? They tend to round and crunch over with those handles, right? So, and then if you push back like this, which creates a better spine, but it promotes the sliding down thing. So I prefer to grab here and pull the butt into the seat, whether you're leaning forward, leaning back, or in a neutral hip position. Okay? No questions? How about using the seat belt? I don't like the seat belt, right? Because we got this rec fem that's supposed to come up here, and these abs that are stabilizing the pelvis. So the last thing I want to do is just take something and go, right? And just like, cut into that tissue, because that's going to give a bunch of feedback. It's, it does provide some stability. I would say of all the exercises that people tend to put seat belts on, this is probably the one that I least hate, okay? But things like hack squats and pendulum squats and leg extensions, like no, right? Especially the leg extension, because the leg extension, you're trying to contract this stuff. So the last thing that you want to do is to put a strap in the middle of it, right? Okay, it's not going to improve contraction quality, right? So don't mummify yourself on the very muscles that you're trying to get to, contract and move. So in my opinion, if you pick a good leg curl, you should never need to seat belt it, right?